Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest California ISO call over the Resource Sufficiency Evaluation, or RSE Enhancements Initiative. Today's discussion is a follow-up workshop from the latest November Market Surveillance Committee, or MSC discussion. I'm joined today here by the lead for this initiative, Daniel Johnson from our policy group, as well as Guillermo Bautista from our market analysis and forecasting group, who will also be our presenters for today. In addition, calls and webinars generally are recorded, including this one for stakeholder convenience, allowing anyone unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. These recordings are publicly available on the webpage for a limited time following the call, and we please request that the recordings and any related transcriptions not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you have any questions, we'll be fielding those throughout. Please raise your hand virtually by pressing the raise hand virtual icon, unless you happen to dial in separately by phone, in which case you would push #2 to get into the queue. And although we prefer verbal, we will also monitor for any chat questions that come through and verbalize those as well. And we please request for everybody to state your name and company when making any comments or questions. And with that, I'll hand it over to Danny.
Thanks, Jimmy. Can we go to the next slide? So the intent of today's meeting is really to provide an opportunity for follow-up discussion. On the 19th of November, we had an MSC call where Guillermo presented some analysis he and his team did on the events of July 9th and how the resource sufficiency evaluation worked. We thought that the analysis was really informative and really helps to paint the picture of how the RSE works and all its intricacies. Unfortunately, due to some scheduling conflicts, I believe we finished that meeting and had about 3 minutes for questions, during which time we were able to answer 2 abbreviated questions. So we wanted to provide this forum today to field further questions to make sure everybody understands the analysis, and then to try to walk through how the CAISO is interpreting the analysis and how this is going to inform our next iteration of the proposal. So with that being said, I wanted to open it up to stakeholders to see if there are any outstanding questions on the analysis that Guillermo presented on the 19th. Jimmy, are there any questions in the queue?
I don't see anything, Yasi, unless you're casing at your end.
I do not.
Thanks.
I'm seeing Dan just asked a question.
Yeah, I'm seeing a hand raised from Dan as well.
Mr. Williams, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I mostly just want to say thank you for publishing the deck. I know I was one of the ones that asked a late question on the NSC meeting, and I don't have anything necessarily to follow up on for now. I just look forward to the discussion during the call, but wanted to say thank you for putting this together. I think the slides are quite helpful, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm getting another comment that some folks aren't seeing the next slide, but it's maybe because it's the same title as the previous slide. So hopefully when we transition, folks won't be able to see it. So sorry for anyone with any difficulty. Hopefully you'll see the next page.
Hey, Jimmy, I see a question in the chat from Steve. Can we try to answer his question and then field Jeff's question? I believe he just raised his hand.
Oh yeah, thanks, Danny. I see that as well. Yeah, Steve asked if we can walk through slides 25. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can get to slide 25 there. In that second deck. Thanks.
Okay, can we get a confirmation that this is the slide that wants to be discussed? And can Steve confirm, please?
I believe it's the next slide, Guillermo. Referencing back to your original presentation, it'd be the next slide because the presentations got combined. I think this is the question.
Okay. Hello, this is Guillermo. I will be happy to go through this slide. The study was built upon the different areas of the real-time market, and the premise of this slide is to highlight the dynamics of the Eim transfers. And for this sake, we are only referring to the CAISO transfers. And a positive value is an import, is transfers coming into the CAISO, and negative value is an export, is transfer going out of the CAISO balancing area. This highlights the dynamic of the peak hours, hour in 17 to 21, and each color represents the different transfers across the different real-time markets, starting from HASP, the hourly ahead scaling process, going through FMM, the 15-minute market, and the real-time interval dispatch, that is the 5-minute transfer. The idea here is to see how these transfers evolved over time. And this is in context of the influence that the load conformance may have in the HASP and FMN transfers, and how that can be relatively different to what actually realizes in the real-time market, the RTD, which for the purpose of the discussion is the ones that are operationally important, because these are the ones that realized the dispatches. It is the RTD market, the one that sends out instructions for resources to follow, and therefore these are the ones that realizes the Eim transfers. Transfers from the 15 or the HASP hourly process, they are financial, pre-dispatch, they do not realize. It is only in the last opportunity of the markets in RTD when we determine what is going to effectively flow across the different balancing areas. And the idea here was that even though for these critical hours, we did have some hours with relatively meaningful transfers coming into the ISO in HASP and FMN, and taking the assumption, the hypothesis that they were influenced by the load conformance, they were of little relevance operationally speaking, because once we go into the real-time market, the ones that really matter are the ones in green, that are the RTD transfers. When we go from, let's say, from a HASP market to the RTD market, you can see that for these specific hours, generally speaking, the system was buying back. So we were buying that much Eim transfers in HASP, as indicated by the dotted line, when in reality, when we come into the RTD market, the ones that effectively realize are the ones in green. The delta, the difference, is the buyback that happens between HASP and FMM, or FMM and the RTD market. And in some cases, you can see that even though we have Eim transfers in the order of at least 1,300 or so, around hour engine 20, in some cases, the direction of the transfers actually reversed, and you can see that for the middle of hour engine 20, it became an export. That means even though we may have had a bias of 2,600 megawatts, potentially influenced to some extent the transfers coming into FMM and the HASP market, when it came to the actual operational transfers that realized in the market, they were indeed in the export direction. It was power going from California balancing area to another balancing area. And that is the whole point, just to highlight that even though you may have high transfers in either HASP or FMM or both, they are financially defined. They are pre-dispatched. They do not realize operationally because it's only the RTD ones that really are implemented once we set the instructions for resources. And that is the main point of this slide. Let me see if there is any follow-up questions on that.
Thanks, Guillermo. Steve said thanks, Steve, so I take it to mean that was a sufficient answer, and I do see a couple more folks in the queue.
Yeah, and before we go into that, Jimmy, let me make just one statement here because this is what I explained in the original session. When I said that it is only RTD transfers that are the operationally meaningful because they are the ones that realize the dispatches. There is only one implication for which the FMM transfers are going to be meaningful, and that is when the CAISO or for practical purposes, any EIM entity fail the test. The value of the transfer determined in that market is going to set up the cap that effectively is going to be defining how much transfers we can or any EIM area can bring into the system. That will be the implication, where to set the cap for the transfers under a failure interval. That will be only the cap. It doesn't have implications in terms of the power that effectively flows through because they are effectively, again, defined by the economical conditions of the RTD market. Okay, do we have any follow-up? Okay, I think we have one follow-up from Dan Williams.
I see he's in the queue as well. I think Steve is good, so thanks a lot, Guillermo, for elaborating. Yas, you can go ahead and open up Dan's line. I think he's next in the queue.
Mr. Williams, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Dan from CES again. And just to follow up on Steve's question, Guillermo, can you discuss just whether these are only EIM transfers or whether these are including any non-RA hourly block imports that would have been scheduled in HASP and kept static for the hour, and or any hourly block exports that would have been scheduled in HASP and kept static for the hour?
Oh, yeah, that's a good clarification. No, this is only EIM transfer results. It doesn't account for any intertie transactions, either imports or exports.
And do you feel like it's a complete picture here without sort of involving those in the discussion?
Well, it depends what the point to be made is, right? And in this case, it's specific to the nature of the transfers across the market. And granted, there are many dynamics that are going to influence the level of transfers from one market to the other. The point here is really about the implications of having certain level of EIM transfers in HASP or FMM versus the operationally meaningful transfers that are the ones realized from RTD. If there are different angles that we want to discuss, yeah, there may be more information to bring in, and that's the reason we have 20 plus more slides to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, and I do get the point on that comparison. The last question I have is just, these are net figures, correct? So are there instances where there are EIM transfers coming in and one EIM transfer point to the CAISO and going out at another at the same time, and this is a net figure for that?
Yes, this is only the net at the CAISO level, and you're right, at any point on time there may be plus and minuses because the interaction is specific to each pair of EIM entities involved in the CAISO. And I believe we have other metrics in other reports, maybe I think it's in either in the summer report for July or in one of the EIM Board of Governors briefing where we provide that breakdown. And yeah, this is only reflecting the net.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. I see a couple more in the queue.
Please go ahead, Mr. Jeff Spires.
Hi, Danny and Guillermo. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I would just echo what Dan mentioned at the beginning and say thanks to the CAISO for putting together all of this analysis. It is very helpful, and so much appreciated the effort that goes into trying to dig into the details on some of these topics. I had started to ask a question at the end of the MSC call, and so maybe I'll try to ask that more completely than there was time for then. But before doing that, I just wanted to make one quick response to Guillermo's discussion just now around the FMM versus the RTD, and I think the line of reasoning or the statements that really what only matters is the RTD dispatch, that's really the operationally meaningful dispatch I don't see it that way. I think the FMM is meaningful. It is dispatching physical resources within the EIM, including in other BAs, to be able to deliver energy to the CAISO. Those resources need to make sure that they are there and that they're ready to deliver on that. And the fact that in a later interval the CAISO may not end up taking final delivery of that energy doesn't make that that original dispatch less physical per se. But another thing I would note is, as Guillermo pointed out, it also results in a financial settlement. So there is an implication on the dispatch of having FMM deliveries, and I don't think that should be understated. And the other thing is, just from the perspective of what are we trying to achieve with a resource sufficiency evaluation, it is a test that's performed in advance of the EIM to validate sufficiency before EIM dispatch. And the EIM dispatch includes both FMM and RTD dispatches. So, I think the concern I have with that line of reasoning is that it sort of leads to saying, well, maybe it's okay to have leaning in the FMM as long as it doesn't end up occurring in the real-time market. And I just don't think that that is the appropriate principle to be attempting to meet here with the test. So I just wanted to provide that feedback on that topic. But in terms of my other question, if we could move forward to slide 29, I would appreciate it.
While we're moving forward, I wanted to respond a little bit, Jeff.
Sure.
I would agree with you that we don't want FMM, or we don't want any leaning, the EIM to be utilized for any leaning that is necessary to cure supply or flexibility shortfalls from an entity. I kind of view this slide as highlighting the dynamics of what was actually occurring and highlighting the net capacity positions and flexibility positions of the ISO through this period.
Fair enough. I just wanted to, like I say, just respond to the kind of what is the FMM and just emphasize that in my mind it's an important element of the dispatch, and it's something that has financial implications as well as physical ones. And I think that that's, we should be striving to make sure this test is accurate in both time frames.
And before we move into the slide number 29, I want to build on that because I think we have been clear that operationally speaking, when we are talking about leaning, it would be interesting to see what the definition of leaning is. Because if now we are saying that the FMM is a financial market, per definition, there is no leaning on that, right? Because it's financial dispatches. They are not transactions that realize operationally. So it's not that we are using that capacity and no longer is available for somebody else. That is a pre-dispatch, it's financial, and I have recognized that, yes, there are financial implications, and we have been clear about that. But when it comes to your item of leaning, I think that is really the genesis of this discussion, right? The only one that realizes some capacity being utilized from somebody else is the ones that are operationally meaningful, and in this case, is the RTD dispatches.
Yeah, I don't agree with that perspective. I think that leaning can occur in the EIM in either or both the FMM and real time. And if there is leaning in the FMM, that is an outcome that is counter to evaluating resource efficiency up front before you've started to run the market. And whether or not, conditions change in a future market dispatch that end up causing the level of transfers to go down at a later time doesn't change the fact that during that FMM dispatch, there was a leaning situation where, and I would define that as you're relying on the EIM transfers to meet the BA obligations and you don't have sufficient unloaded capacity to cover that import. So in other words, you're not economically displacing a higher cost resource, but you're needing that EIM supply to solve the market. Which I think really actually leads to, why don't I just ask the question about this slide, because I think it sort of leads to, I think it was, sorry, can you go to I think it was slide 29.
Is one before?
I believe so.
Operator?
I see. They're pretty similar, and so it probably doesn't matter which one we're looking at. I guess what I wanted to raise here, I think, with the discussion is when we take a step back from talking about the mechanics of the test itself and just look at the outcomes, there are, I think, some outcomes that are illustrated by this example that seem to be counter to what the resource sufficiency evaluation is intended to capture. And because when I'm looking at this, like I mentioned before, the expectation would be that if you have a sufficient BA, the EIM imports that BA is receiving would be economic displacement of higher cost resources. But the data in this chart seems to show examples where the CAISO has EIM transfers that are significant. I believe they were 2,000 megawatts or more in these intervals at the same time that it's facing power balance violations and having to reduce exports. And so the outcomes, putting the test aside, seems to indicate that the CAISO is not, in this example, displacing a higher cost resource, but needing those EIM imports to be able to avoid an even larger power balance violation. And I understand that this particular day was, of course, significant in terms of the events that went on with the transmission derates, and there were also other issues associated with the market. So I don't want to put too much weight on this particular example, but the reason I think it's worth talking about this, because the reason that we feel strongly about the load biasing issue is that it seems as though the load biasing plays a role in these outcomes, where the load biasing has the potential to put the CAISO in the position of not having enough supply to meet that higher load that's running the market, which means that the EIM transfers must be used to meet that load, and otherwise there's no solution and there would be a power balance violation potentially. So I just wanted to raise that in more detail and hear what your reaction to that is, because it does seem that these types of results are not consistent with what we'd expect from a resource sufficiency point of view.
Yeah, yes. Well, I would like to unpack this a little bit because I don't see where the lack of intuition in this outcome is. You're referring to economic displacement. Yeah, and that will happen as long as you have sufficient capacity across the site to be able to have this least cost solution, right? You have a $50 resource that can be displaced by a $30 resource. Yeah, and that is economic displacement as long as you have enough capacity. But here we are talking about days in which we are really tight, not just in the CAISO, but across the West. You know that there will be very little economic displacement just because everybody's trying to get the last megawatt. So I don't see why it wouldn't be the expectation that you are going to simply extract every single megawatt that is available through either additional imports, reduction of exports, being infeasible, or potentially Eim transfers. The piece I failed to follow you through is about the correlation you're making that this is happening because of the Eim, because of the load conformance. The load conformance is only putting more pressure to the bid stack to get additional megawatts, but it's not going to be the only factor that plays a role in terms of what is the optimal solution in terms of deciding how much you are going to be infeasible or how much export you are going to cut. And the whole point of having this illustration is to clearly illustrate that even though you have a 26 megawatt load of conformance, you are not getting 2,600 megawatts of Eim transfer. That was the original hypothesis that was put out there, and I am trying to show you specifically how the numbers play. So having a 2,600 megawatt of load conformance, what effectively gives you is about 29% of additional Eim imports. And the whole discussion about this originally was that, well, because you are using a conformance in HAT, all that should go into the test. And what we're saying is that it's not a one-to-one relationship here. And you can see that depending on the case, and we can pick any other case, and it's going to show a different share of how the load conformance is going to be distributed. But I think it's very clear what the point here is. And the point is, load conformance is not a one-to-one relationship to the Eim transfers.
I appreciate that feedback, Guillermo, and I agree with you that load biasing or load conformance doesn't necessarily increase the EIM transfers one for one, and I don't think that's exactly the concern I'm trying to raise. I think what I'm trying to say with respect to the load conformance is that it's a major factor in the sufficiency test being inaccurate. And that leads to outcomes where even in situations when the CAISO's supply is less than the total demand that it's meeting through the market, it can be deemed to be resource sufficient when it's not. It requires EIM imports to meet the load. And it seemed like this chart illustrates that type of result to some extent. Now, I agree that this is a exceptional set of hours and an exceptional day, so it's not necessarily representative of a broader set of dates, but our concern with this is that we do see outcomes that aren't unique to this day. When we look at other instances over the last couple of summers, either emergency conditions or very high-priced periods where there is, pretty clearly a very limited amount of supply left, and yet large transfers into the CAISO BA that seem to suggest that that supply is being used to meet the load and that the sufficiency test isn't functioning as we'd expect. So I agree this particular day doesn't necessarily tell that complete story, but I think it's illustrative of the broader concern we have that the load biasing, as I mentioned, plays a role in.
Yeah, and this is I think we would like to expand more, Jeff, because I'm not able to see what you're trying to convey here of what is the implication of the load conformance into the outcome of the test. Can you unpack that a little bit more, please?
Sure. Let's say you have 2,500 megawatts of load bias in the FMM. And that leads to a total load forecast of 42,500. And let's say your total supply in the CAISO BA is 40,000 megawatts. In that instance, there is not enough supply to meet the load. There's 40,000 megawatts of supply, and there's 42,500 megawatts of demand.
In FMM, yes.
But the resource sufficiency test will say, because it doesn't include the load bias, it will calculate a pass. But the CAISO does not have enough supply in that example to meet its own load. It has to receive EIM imports to fill that gap. That's the concern, is that it doesn't accurately capture the total needs of the CAISO BA because the load biasing isn't included.
Okay, let me pause there because I think I want to follow on this. So we're saying that because of the FMM load bias of 2,500 megawatts, the FMM total load is 42,500. I agree with that. That is what the FMM is trying to solve against. And we have effectively a capacity range of 40,000 megawatts.
Close attention here. What's up? No.
And sorry, there is somebody with a mute.
Like whatever, and I noticed it when I was sitting because it's in the like rack thing of my closet, and it's like the same color as the bar.
Okay, well, I can't do anything about it right now, so I'll just have to look for it later, or else just squish it.
Is there a way to put everybody on mute, operator? Okay, I think we're good now.
Sure.
So we have a total load of FMM of 42,500. We have a bid range of 40,000 megawatts. And based on the premise that you are building, we should have failed the test because the load is higher than the supply. Well, my question before going to that conclusion would be, what is the load that the actual system has to meet? It's not going to be 42,500 megawatts. It's going to be 40,000, and plus minus the error that may realize between FMM and RTD. So effectively, the actual system has a demand of 40,000 megawatts with a supply of 40,000 megawatts, and we're going to be even. So the test using the 40,000 megawatts is going to reflect the reality of the balancing of the system of 40,000 megawatts. Having a load of 42,500 megawatts is not because our load has effectively increased by 2,500 megawatts. This is the additional load that we are asking to secure additional imports that are going to be in complement of potentially the 40,000 megawatts. But that doesn't change the nature and the real load that has to be met in the system of 40,000 megawatts. That is the piece I don't see the logic holding, Jeff.
Well, I think you're assuming that at some later stage in a future market run, the load is 40,000. But in that instance, in my example where you're running the FMM, you can't solve the market without EIM transfers.
Well, you just said that we have 40,000 megawatts that matches the amount of load, right? Why would the additional transfers be needed?
Because in the FMM, back to my example, you have a 40,000 megawatt load forecast. You bias that in the FMM by 2,500 megawatts.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have a 42,500 megawatt obligation to meet in the FMM. but you only have
Correct.
40,000 megawatts of supply. That's the concern. That's why we've been focusing on the FMM market, because that seems to be the instance most clearly where you can get into this situation where the supply is not sufficient to meet the demand in that market run, and yet the resource sufficiency test would not evaluate that, and it would provide a pass even under that situation.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I just failed to see your point because, again, the FMM load is simply trying to secure the additional supply. It could be internal resources, additionally Eim transfers, potentially some 15-minute imports. That is not the load that is going to be assessed with the test. Neither is the load that actually we have to meet in the real life system. And that is the piece I just failed to see.
I think that I understand, I believe, what you're saying, but I think what you're saying is that it's okay to be short in the FMM, because if I understand what you're saying correctly, the fact that there is not enough supply to meet the load in the FMM shouldn't matter, as long as at a later point in time in the RTD, it ends up that the load is only 40,000. And I think that's part of what I'm taking issue with here, is that that's not consistent with my view of verifying sufficiency ahead of the EIM dispatch, because the EIM dispatch includes both those markets. And as we talked about before, it's a dispatch, it's part of the dispatch of the EIM. And so you get into a situation where the test is not reflecting the needs of the CAISO BA in that FMM market, and can cause a test result that's not consistent with the increased load being used to dispatch EIM supply in the FMM.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to agree to disagree on this, Jeff. I just failed to see the point. And as I indicated before, the Eim transfers eventually are financial. And I'm not saying that there is no single implication. Yes, there may be financial implications because we have a two-step settlement, right? But for the purpose of what we have been discussing about adding straightforward the Eim and the load conformance into the FMM market just because maybe pushing additional transfers. First, it doesn't reflect what eventually the load is going to be met in the real time. And second, I have shown with numbers that it's not a one-to-one relationship. So I see your logic. I just don't follow that through.
Hey, this is Brad Cooper with the CalISO. I think it might be useful if we can clarify this example. So Jeff, when you're saying the load forecast is 40,000, we bias 2,500, for a total load of 42,500. Are you saying, in this example, are you saying that there is a power balance? There would have been a power balance in feasibility anyway with the 40,000, or are you saying, is this just a generic example without a power balance in feasibility?
My example was just generic to try to simplify the concern, and just say, all we're really trying to do is compare in advance of the EIM supply to demand. And
yeah, so
that's all I'm trying to say. I mean, and that's not. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So if I can say what Guillermo is saying another way, if the load forecast really is 40,000 and the load indeed is 40,000, and we're biasing the 2,500 because of a big reason they bias is to ensure we have sufficient unloaded capacity, and a lot of the reason they have to do that is market issues, including FRP not being nodal yet, and so a lot of the unloaded capacity the market's supposed to be getting internal to the ISO, it's not getting because because of the issues with FRP, and so they bias. So this 2,500 megawatts, might be to get, I don't know, 1,000 megawatts of unloaded capacity, because even when you buy it, like Scott Harvey's presentations have gone through, even when you buy it with the FRP problems, they have to overdo it. So, the 25, I think what Guillermo's saying is the 2,500 megawatts bias isn't to meet the load. It is to account for other issues in the market, which, and the bias doesn't directly equate into how many transfers we get. And so, like we've been saying, the better way to address this is for the FRP enhancements to go in, and it can eliminate that source of bias at least.
So this is Danny. The other thing I want to add on, which seem to have kind of driven away from a little bit, is that the ISO doesn't count EIM transfers towards its supply stack in the capacity test. So to the extent that we bias 2,500 megawatts and commit additional internal generation or are able to attract additional block hourly imports, this is similar functionality to what EIM entities are currently able to do through their base scheduling process and their bilateral transacting process. The ISO simply uses a market-based tool to do this. The one place that I thought we had agreement on where there was the potential for this practice to maybe allow the ISO to inappropriately pass the RSE was in the FlexTramp sufficiency test, to the extent that these transfers unloaded CAISO capacity, which then could be shown as additional upward flexibility. I think Guillermo's results here, at least on this small sample size, if you drill down into them, the CAISO ended up in a net less flexible position because we increased our internal resources. When you consider that with PMAX, we had less flexibility, even when you add in the flexibility that we got from the net EIM transfers. So I think I'd agree with what Guillermo and Brad are saying, like the RSE is intending to capture, can each entity meet its demand obligations? It's not intending to enforce how the market is cleared. We're just trying to make sure that when you get to real time, each entity would be self-sufficient. And then this goes back to that, I think, slide 25 that we talked about that shows that when you actually get to real time, the Cal ISO and RTPD was a net exporter on a lot of these intervals.
So, I think there's a bit, you and Brad, Danny mentioned a few different things there. I mean, I recognize load biasing is used for a variety of purposes, but when you boil it down, the CAISO is increasing the demand forecast to secure more supply, and whether it's, energy or, in a sense, a reserve product, to the extent that you're bringing in supply and then giving it back in a later interval, if the uncertainty doesn't materialize, the CAISO operator is looking at the system and saying, I need 42,500 megawatts of supply. And when you compare that to, in my simplistic example, the actual supply that the CAISO has in that example is only 40,000, there's a deficit there that needs to be filled in through the EIM. I think I agree that if it ends up that you secure more non-EIM import supply through the HASP, absolutely that should be included, and I think that would be included in the test. So, to the extent that you're securing supply some other way before the EIM, I think that's legitimate, and that's what's comparable to a bilateral transaction that anyone else would make. If somebody else makes a transaction for bilateral energy, they're doing that in advance of the EIM dispatch. And so I think, HASP, non-EIM HASP intertie bids that come in are comparable to that. But I think the issue is that there is, an element of that differential that is not met by non-EIM imports, but actually met through the EIM itself. And that's the concern. So I think I've covered the points that you were making there, but I also, want to let others have a chance to chime in too, so we can move on.
I mean, I'm just trying to drill down on this example, and what you're saying is it's appropriate for the CAISO to be able to commit internal resources or attract internal supply, but it should be added to the ISO's requirement. If we want to have equal treatment across all BAAs, then the initial base schedule that is submitted by each BAA, any incremental additional transfers they show or internal resources that they commit would not actually be credited towards passing that initial test. It would simply get added to their requirement by that same amount. I think we agree with you that to the extent that EIM transfers unload flexibility, which could aid the ISO in passing the FlexRAM sufficiency test, that's something that we would look to address because it is kind of a gap in this design. But this is just the ISO's way of having similar functionality and having similar treatment to other EIM entities with respect to the RSC.
I think we'll just have to disagree on that final point, because I think for the other entities, if they can't meet the load forecast with non-EIM supply, then they don't pass the sufficiency test. And I think that the outcomes we're talking about here with respect to the CAISO are different from that, because you can end up in a situation where the CAISO can't meet the load forecast and pass because of the difference between what's being evaluated for resource sufficiency, which is a lower load forecast, versus what's being used in the market. And I don't think others have that same issue. So I don't.
I'll go back to that first point though, Jeff. View this through the base scheduling lens. If an entity's initial base schedule, they fail because they don't have enough capacity, and they go and bilaterally transact another 100 megawatts of imports to make sure that they have enough capacity to pass, they're allowed to pass. This is just the ISO's equivalent of doing that same thing, of attracting that same 100 megawatts of imports. So the idea that our requirement should go up by 100 megawatts because we got 100 megawatts more of import isn't consistent with the way other entities are able to interact with the RSC.
I agree, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the other EIM entity has enough supply to meet their load forecast in the market. It's either internal generation, and I don't understand what you're getting at there, because there's no difference on the EIM entity side between the load forecast that's being used to validate their sufficiency and the load forecast that's solving the market. It's the same number.
Hey Jeff, this is Jimmy. Sorry to cut you off. We have to move on time-wise. I appreciate the comment. Definitely more to be continued on this, but I think we've definitely gotten your point. So thanks so much. I have to move on to, or at least the queue. And I know we might have Scott Harvey from MSC if you want to clarify before I move on. I know we've got a couple more though in the queue.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity for the discussion. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott. I'm not sure if you want to jump in, but you can raise your hand to get in the queue. There you are. Operator, if you can just open up Scott Harvey's line real quick, and then we can definitely move on, folks. So thanks for your patience.
Load forecast. Jeff, okay, I think I'm open now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we need to clarify what we're talking about here, because in saying the CAISO can't meet its load forecast, it can meet its load forecast. And that's what Guillermo's data about RTD is relevant to. It says we did have enough, the CAISO did have enough resources in those intervals. It didn't need the FMM transfers. It was trying to force HASP schedules, and that's the way the CAISO does it. I mean, maybe the CAISO can come up with a different way to do it, but the evidence of the RTD is no, we were not short of resources. We were not out of load. There was a CAISO that was scheduling additional in FMM in order to force things to happen. And to put another fact out there that you need to be thinking about anything, anytime you look at anything in 2021, and July 9th is a great example. The CAISO implemented the changes back in 2020 that created a local requirement for the CAISO that bound, and it bound on July 9. And the CAISO had a flexible capacity price, shadow price, that ranged between $50 and $250 during all these hours we're talking about. The shadow price in the EIM was 0. So when the FMM does the evaluation on economics, it's going to say the cost of dispatching up a resource in the CAISO is $50 more than its energy cost, or $250 more, and it's 0 in the rest of the FMM. So of course it's going to schedule those imports in the FMM. Then when it gets to RTD, we know that the shadow price is 0 everywhere, and it says, oh, we don't actually need that. And we dispatch based on energy. The CAISO has lots of capacity. So you need to, anytime you're looking at any of these numbers in 2021, you got to look at what was the shadow price of the FlexiRamp product in the EIM versus the CAISO, and understand that's going to skew the economics. And that's a separate issue. And I agree, that we can't confuse the load forecast that goes into the FMM, which is when it's being used for other purposes, and the fact that it's being used for other purposes is confirmed by when you see that the RTD dispatch is way lower. That means the CAISO didn't actually need those imports, so it wasn't short. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. And I do see we have
so Jenny.
Jenny.
Thank you. I know she's been waiting a little while.
Thanks, operator. If you can open Jenny's line, please.
Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jenny Mystery from Falkiro Project. Good discussion on the load conformance. I just have one comment. Just in general, I think load conformance in RTD versus FMM do have, different purposes, and I agree with that. But the conformance timing is also relevant, when you do the load conformance, and how you can, I guess, get more transfer or commitment after the test is done. But my question really is on slide number 19, if you can go to that slide. Guillermo mentioned on that slide, can we go on slide number 19? Yeah, so on this slide, one of the reasons that was mentioned that, the RSC was not able to pass or, not pass correctly, it was because the market could not access the higher configuration due to telemetry oscillation between configuration. So basically, you have overlapping configuration on your MSG units, and the market was not correctly modeling it where the unit is, and could not allocate appropriate capacity on the RSC test. This is kind of a big thing for us. I don't know about other EIM entities. Most of our MSG fleet has big overlapping configuration, and I just wanted to get more information on, is this been resolved in some fashion, or is this an ongoing, still a problem that was just discovered recently? And if it's still ongoing, when are we going to? How can you ensure that our units are getting accounted properly in capacity or flex during this RSC test?
Thank you, Jenny, for the comment. This is Guillermo, and let me answer in two parts. The first one is that this is not a systemic issue that is impacting every single unit in every single EIM area. It happens that for this specific day, there was one MSG resource that has this logic, and just because it happens to be operating in the critical range of the overlapping configuration where it can easily get confused once they are in one configuration or the other. This is not the time we have discovered this interplay, and there has been some discussion in the past. I think there is room for improvement here that we have been assessing for some time, and it could be as simple as making sure that our EMS is able to receive the status of the configuration of the plant rather than trying to have the market second guessing what configuration it should be. I think that is one of the areas that we have identified that potentially can be used to address this type of issue. But again, let me emphasize that it's not a systemic issue affecting every single MSG unit. It was specific to one MSG unit when it happens to be in that critical range of operation.
Yeah, thank you for the response. I was just concerned because recently we've been seeing some weird kind of operation for our MS units when we are trying to move those units in an overlapping configuration range. So, and we have city tickets for it. I just wanted to make you aware that this may be is this a bigger problem than just that one day.
No, and we are very diligent to make sure that we identify every single dynamic that may impact, for practical purposes, any type of resource, not just MSGs. So we will follow suit the inquiries that you have, and we will investigate what the reason was for that.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Jenny, the one other thing I would add on to Guillermo's comment is part of the changes that we have for the capacity test to utilize the stuck horizon would look at the maximum achievable bid and amount, so that even should issues like this spuriously occur, an entity wouldn't have the capacity that they can show for the RSC cut off. It would be credited to what they could have achieved through that horizon.
Yeah, but wouldn't those bids be overlapping also?
Our plan would be to look at the maximum bid and amount that is achievable.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can discuss after the proposal comes, but thank you.
Thanks. I do see one more question in the queue, and appreciate your mindfulness, folks, as we get closer to the end of the call.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Jay Chong with Foreign General. First, I want to say thank you to Kaizo putting efforts, put the analysis out. I just have two feedbacks. First, I'm not sure if I would agree Danny's point about bilateral market. I'm not sure if low conformance and the bilateral are comparable, because in bilateral, for example, if I call PowerX to purchase power, they can say no to it if we couldn't reach to a consensus. But for low conformance, I'm not sure if entities have the right to block it. And I guess another concern from PGE is we're not talking about 200 megawatt of low conformance, not 500. We're talking about 2,600 megawatt of low conformance. This is for everyone to think about, and maybe we can discuss it a little bit more at a later time. I'm not sure if we want to make the low conformance to be a tool for real-time conversions bidding, because we may unintendedly make the low conformance to be a convergence bidding tool, but only available to the BA. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Now, you made a number of points there, so I'll try to address some of them. I think the last one that is something that we need to think on a little bit. I think that the ISO's ability to attract import bids that are block hourly would be pretty similar to an entity's ability to, say, call up PowerX and come to an agreement to to transfer hourly energy simply because they've already put in the price that they would be willing to make that hourly transaction at. That the market's just simplifying and automating that process of calling somebody and getting a verbal agreement. And regarding the 2,600 megawatts of conformance that was used on this date, that is a lot. I think that it's something that we have slides later in the part of the presentation I was going to go to that try to unpack that and what that actually meant and what it entailed during this operating day. So I'd ask if you kind of pause for a little bit until we get to those slides. Guillermo, did you have anything to add?
I'm good, Danny.
Thanks, Danny. I would just add one last point. I kind of agree with what you said, the first point about, putting in a price. That's the price that we're willing to be dispatched. But in the meantime, for example, for a low conformance, we can, for the CAISO or BA side, could also adjust the load conformance in the RTD market, right? So if we were to make that comparable in the bilateral market, I'm not only buying a call option from PowerX, I'm also getting a put option from them, meaning that I can sell it back to them. But we don't have such a right for low conformance to say no to it.
I would like to point out that load conformance is open to all BAA market operators. The ISO has reasons which we've tried to explain about why we use it, and it's to primarily drive the block hourly transfers and the commitment or redispatch of internal generation. But other EIM entities do have the ability to use load conformance, and I think some of the data that's been reported shows that some of them, to some limited extent, do.
Thanks, Danny. And again, I appreciate the feedback, and I don't want to take up too much time. I guess we'll just take it back and have more discussions at a later time.
Thanks, and thanks, Danny, for clarifying all that, and appreciate you guys being mindful of the time. Please let us know, Danny, which slide you want us to jump to. Well,
I'd like to open it up one more time and see if there's any more questions on the analysis that was presented to make sure everybody has a firm understanding of what it's saying. I do see one more question.
Hey, Danny, Dan from Customized Energy Solutions. I just wanted to pick up on one thing to bookmark from what Dr. Harvey said at the end of his comments, and that's that it feels like we're often mixing between identifying this as a price formation problem and potentially a price performance problem, similar to what Z just said from PGE. And maybe that's just something that the NSC needs to follow up on more, is the interplay between the two intertie markets, between the hourly block market and the EIM market, and what is going on there, and including with the impact of the FRP. So I'll just leave it there as a comment that there may be more discussion in other areas that needs to happen.
Thanks, Dan. I think we would agree with that point, and I think that we're actively trying to look into that interaction. So Jimmy, can we go, if there's no other questions, can we go to the first of the slides after Guillermo's presentation?
Thanks. Yeah, I don't see any further questions. Yeah, so if you could go back to the other portion of the deck. We'll give you some time to transition.
I haven't seen anything move on my screen. Is the slide deck moving?
Is this the correct one? Just give it 1 second.
No, that would be the second slide of, I think, Guillermo's presentation.
1 second, please.
Hey, folks, as we're making the transition, sorry for the inconvenience and technical difficulties, but we'll take any further questions, I guess, until the time. It looks like these slides changing. Yossi, let me know if you want me to try and pull it up from my end, if that's easier. I do see one question in the queue.
Can we please unmute Steve?
Hi, Steve Kearns, Public Generating Pool. I'd be glad to offer a question here to help fill the time while you transition. What I have in my mind right now is that picture that shows the hourly average amounts of load conformance that CAISO uses that's reported in the DMM reports. That indicates a pattern that as you get to evening peak, there's a significant amount more load conformance than on other hours. What I'm curious about is whether or not there's any evidence that you have at CAISO that you're having systemic forecast error or under forecasting net load on those hours, at least as compared to other EIM entities. And if so, the best solution may be to just improve your forecast so that you are not systemically under forecasting net load.
Hi, this is Guillermo from Market Analysis and Forecasting. I can tell you conclusively that we don't have a forecasting issue. We actually are very transparent and we post all the accuracy metrics about forecast for load, wind, and solar. Indeed, we're going to update the metrics tomorrow in the market performance forum. They are publicly available. Our forecast error in the day-ahead market may be in the range of 2-3%. In the real time, maybe a fraction of a percent. And the load bias is not in general to address load forecasting accuracy.
And even though the load forecast is 2 to 3%, which is a pretty good load forecast, it's kind of plus or minus 2 to 3%, right? It's not under forecasting 2 to 3% consistently.
No, and I'm sorry, and I didn't mean just to refer to load. I mean in general our forecast. And you can see all the metrics that are available for load, wind, and solar. And these are based on the standard MAPE metrics that are widely used for forecasting accuracy.
Okay, I will look around for some more information on that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Steve and Guillermo. I think, Yossi, there's a slide with the schedule on it. If you can advance to that slide.
No, not that slide.
It's just a plain chart with a schedule on it. Hey, Yahtzee, if it's easier for me to share my screen, let me know. There you go.
Might be. Okay. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Oh, okay, thanks. So starting up again, I wanted to give an update on where we are schedule-wise. Today is December 8th. We're having this follow-up workshop. We're looking to take the kind of the output and the feedback we get through this workshop and work towards publishing a revised draft final proposal near the end of next week. I think we're targeting the 16th. We would then look to have a stakeholder call based off the changes that are in that revised draft final proposal the following week on Tuesday the 21st. Recognizing that the end of the month has a couple holidays in it, we would add a week to the comment period to have comments due January 10th. That would then allow us to prepare board materials to take the first phase of the RSCE proposal to the joint governance meeting February 9th of 2022. Can we go to the next slide? So when we looked at this internally, one of our big takeaways from the analysis that Guillermo was able to put together and present at that MSC meeting was that the CAISO, through its HAS process, can clear significant volumes of exports based on access to advisory Eim transfers. I think we've always recognized that this was a possibility. The size and the volume of those exports that were cleared are giving us pause and are kind of making us rethink how we're considering the HASP and RSC interaction. I think there's a real question on if transport or if hourly exports that are enabled by access to advisory Eim transfers, if those should be added to the CAISO's requirements, because right now they are being added to the CAISO's requirements. I think there is a line of thinking that the CAISO do have similar treatment to Eim entities who only allow exports that they're able to confidently say they're able to support. Our last stab at doing this would be the day-ahead RUC process. That's a real blunt force approach to do this. I think there'd be other ways where we could try to develop counterfactuals to determine the volume of exports, which may have been enabled by access to Eim transfers that are in excess of the CAISO's internal supply that would potentially be excluded. But we think that this interaction actually potentially explains a lot of the kind of odd results we've seen posted by the DMM, which have led many to assume that the CAISO is systemically leaning. I think it's worth considering this interaction and going through those graphs again. So can we go to the next slide? So this is listed from Guillermo's presentation and is highlighting, I think, kind of the worst instance of this. The CAISO in hour ending 19 did fail the RSC. The CAISO cleared almost 4,100 megawatts of exports out of HASP beyond what was cleared and supported out of the RUC process. Now, some of these exports very likely were supported and should have been supported by resources internal to the CAISO, but we think the fact that there's this volume of exports means at least a chunk of these were likely supported by access to advisory EIM energy through that HASP process. So can we go to the next slide? And this is the graph I was referencing. It kind of shows that the net EIM imports are in excess of the unloaded capacity, and it shows about a 2,000 megawatt gap of potential net EIM imports greater than the unloaded supply within the CAISO. So I think if you kind of consider this HASP interaction, there's a couple different ways to view this. First, should the CAISO's imbalance requirements have been this high, to the extent that these exports were cleared by supply that the CAISO is not then able to count in its supply stack, the imbalance requirement that the CAISO is trying to meet could actually be artificially inflated. Second, just due to market dynamics, the CAISO could be relying on access to an advisory EIM import and then clearing an export with its own internal supply. I think an example would be if there's congestion internal to the CAISO, that just might be a efficient market outcome. That partially could explain this gap that shows that the CAISO has more net EIM imports than unloaded capacity. I don't know if this is necessarily saying that the CAISO is resource sufficient in this condition. There is the potential that this is being driven by that market interaction out of the HASP, and is something that we think warrants significant additional analysis to better understand and to try to better capture and to try to really drive towards accurately reflecting in the RSE requirements that the CAISO is trying to meet what its actual demand and export obligations should be. I'd like to pause and see if we have any questions. I see a question from Jeff.
Hi, Danny. It's Jeff Spires again. Thanks for raising this issue. I agree with you that it is appears to be a significant issue that warrants more consideration and more evaluation. I agree with what you said towards the beginning, that different from the CAISO, if you're in the bilateral world and you're an EIM entity, you won't make a bilateral sale unless you have enough of your own supply to support that transaction. And if you don't do that, if you were to oversell your system and then use the EIM as to backfill the shortfall, then you wouldn't pass resource sufficiency. And if you were somehow doing that, you would be considered to be leaning, basically, because you would be leaving your system short and then relying on EIM imports to come in and fill the gap. And of course, as we talked about a lot, the whole point of the sufficiency test is to try to make sure you can meet your obligations on a standalone basis, which would be load as well as your sales. And so I realize, that's not what the CAISO is trying to do here, but it does seem to be an outcome where, as you point out, non-EIM exports are clearing against EIM supply coming in the HASP. So we haven't really thought through exactly what the right solution is, but I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts for further consideration on that. Maybe the most kind of intuitive answer would be to say, well, it'd be great if the CAISO could find a way to say, evaluate the residual capacity that it has available and say, I'm not going to accept the export unless I have enough supply to support it, and otherwise I'm not going to make that transaction. But I realize there could be some complexities around trying to do something like that. But that is one option. I think the other option would be to say, okay, if non-EIM exports are allowed and can be supported by EIM imports, then those exports should be clearly identified on the E-tag as being non-firm, which would represent more transparently that those are purely economy exports. They're not supported by generation within the CAISO, and they're essentially a non-firm product. And that would allow them to be differentiated so that the exporter and whichever BA is ultimately receiving that energy understands what the nature of that product is. And I think that would be something that would be important. It would also, you could look at the penalty prices to say, well, those should be probably the lowest priority and be curtailed first if there was a supply issue within the EIM. And I think the last thing I'd say is this approach, if you did it that way and then you said, okay, we're not going to include that in our resource sufficiency obligation because it's a non-firm export, then I think we would have to have a similar approach for all EIM entities to be able to do essentially non-firm economy exports and not include that in their obligations. So I think probably more thought is needed there, but that was just a couple of thoughts we had about what potential avenues might be to try to resolve this issue, because I agree with you that it's a concern.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways we could slice this, and it probably is going to require significant additional policy development to make sure everybody's comfortable with whatever the outcome. I think I'm kind of stealing my own punchline a little bit, but this and the potential volume of these exports being added to the CAISO's requirements are kind of what's giving us a little bit of pause in even trying to add a portion of the EIM transfers that are driven by load conformance to the CAISO's requirement, because I think there's a real chance that our requirement is already due to, from this greater than any benefit we would derive from those transfers. So, but I think this is an item that will require significant additional work in the second phase of this initiative. I think Dan is next in the queue.
Thanks, Danny. Dan from CES. I just was going to kind of go in the same direction that Jeff did, just to encourage thinking more broadly about market dynamics and price formation and not drilling down too narrowly on just on the test. Of course, you have to address that part too, but it feels like having non-EIM exports compete with non-RA imports, so understanding hourly block against hourly block in HASP, makes sense, because you have the same type of capacity and same value, sort of fighting it out for what the net import-export position then becomes. But kind of going back to Z's point from PGE, when in this circumstance, it seems like the non-EIM exports more or less have a call option on the EIM transfers. And with the way that EIM transfers are priced, that's just doesn't feel like a very fair market dynamic, or one that will drive very efficient market outcomes long term. But I think in order just to get into that question, you have to zoom out quite a bit to look at kind of pricing dynamics and price formation, price performance, that sort of thing. So more comment than a question, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I think you're highlighting kind of that this is a little bit of a Pandora's box that we're looking at through the lens of what is this doing to the CAISO in the RSC, but is a much bigger question.
Yeah, this is Brad, though, but maybe I'm misunderstanding Dan's point. Those even though those are hourly exports, they pay the 15-minute market price, which would be the same price paid to the well, maybe I'm getting that wrong because we don't specifically settle transfers, but at least the time frame of the market, the market is pricing everything on the same basis. It's not like the exports are paying based on the price at the time of HASP, and then the transfers in are being settled at FNM price. The prices should sync up.
I guess where I was going, Brad, is that EIM transfers are, to me, fundamentally priced differently than non-RA hourly block imports and how those bid into the market. But it would take us far afield to go there, so we'll follow up at another time.
Okay, thanks.
I think I see one more question from Michelle.
Hey, Danny, this is Michelle Keto. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So with regard to the 4,100 megawatts of exports that were occurring on July 9th, this was also, I think, during the time that we were under an EEA2 or an EEA3. And I'm just wondering, under those circumstances, we were in the EEA2 or EEA3 because of the transmission lines going down. When the transmission lines go down in that time frame, you can't cut exports, right? Because exports have a higher penalty parameter. Is that right?
It depends on the nature of the exports, Michelle. The ones that are high priority are not going to be cut. Those that are low priority or real time, they will be not clear or partially cut.
So they can be cut in, is that FMM? So they can be cut after the HASP?
Oh yeah, HASP is the last opportunity to clear or to cut for that practical purpose. After HASP, everything flows. If something is going to be cut, is after the fact.
Right.
After
so
the
after,
market, yeah.
Okay. So if a transmission line goes down after HASP and we lose the imports, we'll still support the export based on the penalty prices. Is that right?
If they are standing alone exports, yes, because, well, let me caveat. Yes, in general, you are right. If we have the rate of an intertie because we have an outage or something happen, we're going to cut everything that belongs to that intertie to bring it within the limit. And if it is an import limitation, it's going to result in reducing imports. There may be cases in which you are also carrying exports on that same intertie, and they actually help you to counterflow and bring more imports. So I wouldn't generalize.
Okay, but if they're at a different tie, so say you're importing in the north and you're exporting at the south, but the tie goes down in the north, if that occurs after HASP, the exports will be flowing, right, because of the penalty parameters?
Yeah, and not just because of that, because it's past the matter where you can really reassess the clearing, right? And the HASP is the last opportunity for you to clear the interties.
Okay, so then if that happens, then you go into an EEA2 or EA3 because your exports were potentially supported by your imports, but you no longer have your imports. I'm just wondering, is that what part of this initiative is to say that you fail the RSC test because you're in an EEA2 or an EEA3, so that's going to be an automatic. And I see at the end, you're also proposing that other emergencies make automatic failure of the RSE, voltage support or something. But it could be that you're failing the RSE because you lost imports, but you're still supporting the exports and you're unable to do that. Is that right? I'm just wondering if what you guys are raising here sort of raises the question of whether it's appropriate to fail the RSE because of system emergencies, such as the one that occurred on July 9th.
I wish there could be a simpler answer, Michelle. I think everything boils down to the timing, because, for instance, what happened on July 9th was that the resource sufficiency evaluation was not able to see for some time at the beginning of the issue when we have this reduced capacity. So it was accounting for the nominal capacity that could have been clearing HASP, even though for 1-2 hours we already were in the rate mode.
Right. Okay, well, it just seems like if the reason we're failing the resource sufficiency is not because we have sufficient resource, but because of the market functionality that you lose the imports, but you don't cut the exports that are supported by those, as you guys have noted here, that potentially the exports are supported by the imports, in this case, the EIM advisory imports, it seems like you're backing off a lot of other things because of this potential interaction. And I'm just noting that, the emergencies potentially come because of this as well. So I think that's just my point.
Yeah, it was a contributing factor, yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, Michelle. Jimmy, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Thanks, everyone, for your comments.
So we already talked a little bit about this slide, but I did want to reiterate that the CAISO uses load conformance as a market tool to secure additional supply and flexibility in real time. We view this as equivalent to an EIM entity being able to base schedule additional resources if they need to, or to secure additional bilateral supply to maintain bid range on additional resources in their fleet. I also want to reiterate that the RSC is not designed as a reliability check. It simply does each entity have enough capacity to be able to beneficially transact with all the other participants in the EIM. To the extent that a system operator in the CAISO or any other BAA would look to use load conformance to have additional supply margin or to have additional flexibility to make them more comfortable operating the system, I don't think that from the ISO's perspective, we want the RSC to prevent that type of behavior or for reliable operating behavior to potentially exclude entities from being able to participate in the RSE. I think a simple example of this is if there's a lot of fires in California and the ISO system operators want to use load conformance to make sure that they have more reserves in case they use a line. It, to us, doesn't make sense that we would then in turn fail the RSE and lose out on economic transfers because we're trying to make sure that we have additional reserves on our system. Next slide. So I think circling back a little bit, the analysis did show that load conformance can lead to incremental EIM transfers. We still would view these in the context of the RSE only being inappropriate or potentially allowing the CAISO to inappropriately pass the RSE to the extent that they unload supply internal to the CAISO, which then could be shown as additional flexibility in passing the flex ramp sufficiency test. For the capacity test, the CAISO simply can't count those imports as supply, nor are they credited, nor are they counted on the demand obligation stack for the entity who they'd be sourced from. So this is, to us, an issue with the flexible sufficiency test. And at least with that July 9th snapshot, when you consider the redispatch of our internal resources, the fact that they have P-maxes, and the EIM transfers that we did receive, our use of load conformance actually reduced our ability to pass the flex ramp test. We were left with, for the purposes of passing the RSE, at least a less flexible operating system and would have been more likely to fail. So all this is to say, I think the CAISO is open to adding some form of load conformance that could lead to EIM transfers that unload supply internal to the CAISO, which aid it in passing the flex ramp sufficiency test. But given the complication around this topic regarding it not being a one-to-one ratio of conformance to EIM transfers and the potential for the CAISO's requirement to already be inflated via those hourly exports that are cleared based on advisory EIM transfers, we're really wary of making that change at this time. We think that doing this could lead to a significant increase in spurious failures, and that can in turn ultimately inappropriately disadvantage the CAISO in trying to participate in EIM. Next slide. So we're left with three options that we're trying to work through to try to address this. We are open-minded, and this is kind of what we're considering right now. The first would be to try to calculate and add the effect of load conformance in driving those EIM transfers. That requirement would be added to the flexible up requirement in the flexible ramp sufficiency test. So our thought would be we could go back over the last couple of years and maybe look at a lot of the tight supply days and see if we can draw a correlation between the CAISO's load conformance and those incremental load conformance driven EIM transfers. If we can get that correlation, then it would be used as a multiplier. That multiplier times the load conformance that's used in that FMM reference interval to add to the CAISO's upward requirement. I think to the extent that we'd even consider this, we would want to avoid doing it during normal operating conditions, since really this is most likely a concern when the system is very stressed and the CAISO doesn't have additional flexibility in its system. So we would try to have some bounds of when this would occur. I think this is kind of a tricky question too, because what's the best proxy of these conditions? Is that the CAISO not clearing the full export quantity through the previous day's ROC? I think wanting to have equivalent treatment for all EIM participants, we would probably want to apply a similar methodology for everybody. And then we're trying to get what is a proxy of tight system conditions for entities that operate in the bilateral world. We went down this path in the System Market Power Initiative, and this was not a straightforward or simple topic to try to get alignment on what is a tight system condition. So I can envision a similar robust debate on this topic in the context of RSE. Can we go to the next slide, Jimmy? So I think the advantage of this approach is it does attempt to account for load conformance's impact on unloading internal capacity to allow the CAISO to pass the flexible ramp sufficiency test. The disadvantages are this would be done on a really small sample size, so it may not be very indicative of the actual impact on load conformance to Eim transfers, and it could still lead to spurious failures during tight system conditions to the extent that these failures don't occur when the CAISO is actually resource insufficient. It limits benefit to all EIM entities, since the CAISO would be frozen out and entities wouldn't be able to transact with the CAISO, while also creating a reliability risk for the CAISO. It's also unknown at this time whether implementation of this type of design is implementable by summer of 2022. A lot of the design we've done on this first phase has targeted summer of 2022, and the choices we've made have leveraged existing CAISO functionality that we already have built into our market or existing CAISO policy, and build upon that. We've already started to do some of the technology work to try to get some of those changes in place by summer of 2022. This would be kind of starting from a cold start with a much shorter runway. So I think at this time we're not able to guarantee that implementation would be feasible. Can we go to the next slide? So the next option, which I think Guillermo talked a little bit about earlier, would be trying to add the load conformance that's seen in the RTD interval to the CAISO's flexible ramp-up requirement. The idea here is that this is the actual load conformance that physically, or this is the actual load conformance that can lead to Eim transfers that physically occur rather than the financial or uncertainty or based load conformance in RTPD. I think we'd have to work through a lot of the same issues that we have with option one about when this would be applied. Would this be an average RTD conformance? What is the time duration it would be averaged over? These are all items that I think need further stakeholder development. Can we go to the next slide? So advantages here again are representative of the actual load conformance that's used in the real-time dispatch. The disadvantages are similar. It can lead to, again, spurious failures. This conformance isn't reflective of the reference interval that actually informs the FlexRAMP sufficiency test requirements, so that is an issue too. It also potentially doesn't capture leaning that could occur on the capacity of other EIM entities to the extent that the uncertainty that Eim Transfer is trying to address doesn't actually materialize by that RTD dispatch. So that is another kind of outstanding issue with this approach. Further, we're going to run into a lot of the same challenges in getting this implemented by summer of 2022, given that this is still new and we're still trying to finalize and figure out what the design would look like. Can we go to the next slide? So option three would be, again, to press pause and not add any load conformance to the RSE requirements as part of phase one. I think this is where we've internally, CAISO staff at least, some of us have landed as being the best approach. I think the July 9th analysis really highlights that there's a lot of different moving pieces here between how the market clears and then what gets used in the RSE's requirement. And so to the extent that we're driving towards an accurate RSE that measures the expected demand and export obligations of each BAA, I think adding any form of load conformance here without correcting for some of the other underlying issues that we've identified drives us farther away from that goal and would further disadvantage the CAISO in its EIM and RSE participation. Again, the final bullet here is that we are proposing those emergency backstops, emergency actions that would constitute a backstop that ensures that to the extent that load conformance could drive outcomes that could be construed as leaning, that those aren't able to continue forever, then this backstop would try to at least limit the extent of those. Can we go to the next slide? So I'd like to kind of pause and get feedback, at least right now, regarding kind of the direction for the phase one idea on load conformance. I think before we take questions, I do want to reiterate that this is an issue that the CAISO takes seriously and is looking to accurately address. We just don't think right now any proposal would be able to accurately address the load conformance issue. So I'll leave it there, and I see Jeff has his hand raised.
Hi, Danny. It's Jeff Spires again. I won't comment on the actual proposals here. I just wanted to make a suggestion about the timelines and the approach for how to tackle some of these things. Thinking back to what we were originally trying to accomplish with this initiative, we had the first phase. It was the whole purpose of that phase was to address the inaccuracies so that then we could move into a robust discussion of the failure consequences in phase two. And I think what we've been talking about here today are a number of significant topics, of course, and load biasing being one of them, but also the clearing non-EIM exports issue that you just raised, and a couple of others as well that we haven't talked about today, but the net load uncertainty, for example, where there have been concerns raised and there isn't, as of yet, a clear solution, at least a long-term solution on addressing some of those. So I think the concern I have about this option 3 approach is it would ultimately defer some of these unresolved accuracy challenges to phase 2, which isn't set to start till July, I believe. So it sort of becomes a certainty that we won't be able to resolve those issues until sometime after the summer of 2022. So, I understand the desire to move forward with the enhancements you have put forward in the proposal, and I recognize there are some challenges around not only agreeing on the policy, but also on the implementation. But, maybe a different approach for some consideration is to actually bifurcate this first phase into two subcomponents. Phase 1A being essentially the current proposal, moving that forward, getting it over the finish line and working on and implementing those changes, but then committing to resolving and discussing these other accuracy concerns as part of a phase 1B initiative that kicks off right away. And then we can really focus on getting into some of these topics we've been discussing today and trying to find consensus on them as soon as we can and try to have those issues resolved prior to entering phase 2 in the middle of next year, when we're also going to be tackling complicated topics associated with the failure consequences. So, I'd hate to, we have concerns about some of the areas that we haven't yet addressed, but we are appreciating the dialogue and discussion here, and I think it would be a shame to kind of put it aside and not make any progress for several months in the interim between phase 1 and phase 2.
Thanks for your comments, Jeff. I think that I can't comment for my management regarding when we could start phase 1B, given a lot of the other items that are currently on the ISO's plate. But I don't think, at least from my perspective, this is something that we are looking to indefinitely punt. It's something that we would look to address as soon as possible. And you did mention kind of uncertainty, so I want to go to the last slide to kind of highlight what other changes we're planning on making in this revised draft final proposal, because with the exception of this load conformance issue, which I think we've identified as being fairly nuanced and complicated and needs additional work, I think a lot of the other changes we're making actually drive this proposal to a place that'll have a lot of stakeholder support. Can we move to the next slide? So the other proposed changes that we're looking to make in the revised draft final proposal, based on the feedback that we received in our first final proposal comments, as well as the stakeholder call after that, would be to make the quantity of megawatt crediting through that stuck horizon for the capacity test configurable. So to the extent that future analysis shows that this design is continually systemically still over crediting capacity that is stranded, we would have the ability and the authority to make those changes. We are also looking to remove the proposed penalties for demand response misuse. One of our concerns is that this functionality could be misused potentially to make it easier to pass the RSE. However, given the issues and the liabilities, some of our kind of off-the-shelf proposed penalty structures created for entities, we think it's prudent to, at this point, just use more of a trust and verify approach. So that we're going to allow this functionality to be used, and then to the extent that the DMM reporting shows that it's being misused, then in the second phase, design more targeted penalty approaches. On the topic of uncertainty, we are looking to suspend the net load uncertainty from the capacity test under our existing FERC provision. If you recall, when we did our summer of 2021 enhancements, we actually identified that the existing histogram methodology had some shortcomings and some kind of baked in inaccuracies. We were hopeful in looking to the quantile regression methodology that comes along with FRP as resolving a lot of those concerns. That was actually originally slated for a fall of 2021 release. That's now been pushed out to fall of 2022. Given that I think we all recognize there's a lot of concerns with this, those concerns that we had materialized over last summer, we would look to suspend this until such time that we have an agreed upon net load uncertainty calculation that can be added to the capacity test. I think from our perspective, the quantile regression gets us there, but we would want to work with EIM entities to make sure that that's working correctly, they understand the results, and that they agree that this is a good predictor of capacity test, of uncertainty within the capacity test horizon prior to adding anything back into the capacity test. Further, we're looking to suspend the intertie uncertainty adder from the capacity test. The analysis that we put out showed that the existing design isn't necessarily super accurate in predicting future intertie uncertainty. We've also heard a lot of feedback that this test is fairly complex and difficult to parallel on each EIM BAA system, so entities aren't able to kind of filter through the data and identify any outlier events and ask the CAISO to exclude them. So until we have a better design that's a little bit more accurate and provide entities with the ability to understand how that design works and filter for outlier events, I think we would also look to exclude this from the capacity test. The final point would be to expand the emergency actions that would lock incremental EIM transfers. One of the comments we heard is a lot of these actions are kind of targeted around actions that CAISO took. There are other emergency actions that BAAs can take that should trigger similar treatment. When we started thinking about this, one that jumped to mind was if an entity is issuing system-wide voltage reductions outside of normal or nominal operating voltage ranges for the purposes of reducing megawatt consumption, that would definitely be a demonstration of resource insufficiency, so we would look to add that. We are still open to other emergency actions which the stakeholder community thinks demonstrate resource insufficiency and can add them as needed through the second phase of this initiative. So this is my last slide. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to pause and see if we have any more questions.
Thanks, Dan. There's a lot of information. I don't see any questions in the queue or in the chat.
Okay, well, I'd like to kind of turn to my fellow panelists and see if anybody else has any other context or comments that you want to add before we adjourn.
None for me.
All right, hearing none, thank you to Guillermo and Brad and everybody, and Brittany and everybody else who's been involved in this process, and we look forward to putting out a revised draft final proposal, hopefully near the end of next week, and then having another call to talk about this in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.